And there's all kinds of lore on that whole story, which we don't need to get into. But basically, the cosmetic industry is buying up all this stuff, and the chocolate industry has been basically replacing the butter with genetically modified soy lecithin and milk, dirty milk powder. So if you look at these products, you look at like a lot of the conventional chocolate products, like the Hershey's Kisses, right? AKA the kiss of death. The kiss that's led to like the diabetes epidemic, candida, and every kind of gut dysbiotic condition you can think of. Just look into it. You'll see genetically modified soy lecithin, you'll see refined sugar, and you'll see milk powder. That's what's being used as a binding agent, a filler. Because if you, like I was having this conversation today, when you bite into the best dark chocolate product, you may notice what is called the speed bump. You want to know that? When you bite into that bar and it's going, stops. The flavor profile kind of like stops you in your tracks. Now you may not notice this if you haven't I'm kind of a chocolate snob, so you know, I'm very specific. Even in the raw chocolate field, I'm very specific. Like Sacred Chocolate is like, to me, that is the best chocolate bar in the world. And definitely the chocolate bar that you make in your own kitchen is the best chocolate bar in the world, by far. Because what you do is you imprint your own conscious aptitude on the fat of the cacao. I have a radio show actually now called the Expanded Health and Human Potential Radio Show. I had my friend Steve Adler on the radio show. He is the primary founder of Sacred Chocolate. And we were talking about the ins and outs of like love, the heart, the science behind the heart, and he's actually the minister of the Sacred Heart. That's his made-up religion, and that's what he does. And we were talking about this idea. I brought it up about Masaru Emoto. You guys know about Masaru Emoto, the secret messages, the hidden messages in water, right? So where he did research that actually the energy that you imbue upon water creates informational formations within the water. Basically like the crystalline structure. We've heard like water is structured, right? Well, what the hell does that mean? That basically means that it's containing information. So when water's in formation, it contains information. And water is a big subject. Basically, it's informed by the structure of hydrogen molecules. And when you, for example, when you imbue your energy or your emotional resonance, whatever you want to say, on the water, it starts to form a structure. This has been scientifically validated by Masaru Emoto's research. And what's actually happening is cacao is actually doing the same thing. But it's the fat that does it. So when you're stripping the fat out of these chocolate products, you strip out the sacredness, the integrity of that chocolate bar. Does this make sense? Because the fatty crystals, actually when you apply heat to it, they start to loosen up. Now they don't degrade. Like chocolate is a saturated fat. Just so we're clear on this, there's different foods have different flash points or heat durability. So saturated fat like coconut oil, specifically cacao, has a much higher heat durability than, let's say, like olive oil, right? That's why you never cook with olive oil, because it can't really resist high heat and it transfers into a rancid fatty acid. Now, when you heat cacao butter to liquefy it, for example, those bonds start to loosen up and it becomes relaxed. So obviously that's how it turns into a liquid. Now, you can actually process your imagination, your energy, your goals. If you're in a goal setting, there's no better time to set goals than making chocolate, because it gets you into the moment. There's something about chocolate alchemy and being your own Willy Wonka and having your own chocolate factory that actually taps you into the moment, right then, right now. Right? And it actually, you can imbue your energy onto the chocolate. And my friend Steve Adler, he's known for this. He actually, it's a guideline in the factory that he works in that He prays over every batch for 30 minutes. He's the minister of the Sacred Heart. That's what that's all about. And when you bite into sacred chocolate, you will notice a difference. You will notice your emotional chemistry. You will notice the way you feel. There's an uplifting that happens. And this actually happens in all unprocessed chocolate bars because it's intrinsic with love. Cacao, where it first came from, is born out of love. And this is an important principle, is that if you eat food that's the product of love, that's the product of gratitude, of humility, of reverence, of sacredness, all of it, you are actually transmitting those noble principles or values into your whole structure. And you can look at this from a scientific, very hard-nosed, physics, scientific angle. You can look at it esoterically. You can look at it philosophically, all of it. And I like to talk about all these things to appeal to different aspects of our own awareness, wherever we might be. Now, going back down to history, now no food in the world is more mythologically referenced than cacao. When I say mythologically, I'm not talking about historical data. I'm actually talking about mythology. Okay? Now, as I got obsessed about cacao, chocolate, and the whole history behind it, I started to turn up books on Mayan history, or not just Mayan history, but Mesoamerican history. I really got into it because I've always, for example, the return of Quetzalcoatl. Does anyone even know, has anyone ever heard of that? 2012, right? There's this guy, Daniel Pinchbeck, he wrote this book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. What is 2012 what is this commotion about 2012 all about? Did anyone even know what I'm talking about? Right, the water bear, right? By the way, we're starting to bear our own water. If anyone's noticed, there's a spring water revolution going on. I was doing a chocolate workshop, and we had fresh spring water there. I was like, yeah. By the way, it's the age of Aquarius. What is that? It's the water bear, right? We're getting out of the tap water reality, and we're starting to go to springs and bear our own water. Interesting. Okay, so back to the story. I got really into the history, and I started pulling up books like the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh is basically the Mesoamerican Bible, the version of the Bible. So we have our Bible, which has been rewritten over and over and over, and I don't even know what's going on with it now. But they have their own version of the Bible. Now, we've all heard the tree of knowledge, the tree of sin, right? Now, to the Mexican people, the apple tree, this is the funniest thing in the world to me if you get into food, history, and science. The apple tree. We didn't really have apples the way we do back then. It wasn't quite in the same. I think that was just kind of like a way that we're able to reference that story. I'm not saying it's true or false, but I just find that a funny little social thing that I to nitpick about. The apple tree, for example. Now, the same thing was talked about in the Popol Vuh, except instead of an apple tree, it was a cacao tree. And there were a few other trees as well. They had multiple trees that signified the same exact thing. The tree of knowledge and the tree of sin. Now, to the Mesoamerican people, this had a different meaning. The tree of knowledge was basically given to us in the mythology, by Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl is the Mesoamerican god. Just to give you the short of it, it's basically the Mesoamerican god that traveled down from wherever. He was hanging out with all the other gods, having a good time. He got bored with that, and then he's like, okay, I'm going to come down to earth. He actually planted the first cacao tree and taught the people how to cultivate this tree. Now, because of that, he was actually banished. He was banished by the gods because they were like, what are you doing? Like, this is our nectar of life. This is how it's written, by the way. I'm not just this is why I'm so into it, because it's written like this in the mythology. This was their elixir of life. This was their nectar. And so he was banished in the story. And there is an interesting story that I just want to imbue upon you since I got on the whole biblical reference. I came across, I found a book on chocolate. It's a 1,000-page book on the history of chocolate. This blew my mind. And there was a reference of Jesus Christ in chocolate, in cacao. And basically what it was talking about was that when Jesus, this is one of the theories on how chocolate came to be, when Jesus was running away from his captors, he actually found refuge underneath the Theobroma cacao tree. Now, at this point, the cacao tree was nothing special, but he found refuge. He tapped the tree, and these white flowers came down from the tree and covered him from his captors. And from that instant, he dubbed this a sacred tree, hence the tree of knowledge, right? And then the other name is the tree of sin, which was referenced towards, actually, I believe they called it the tree of sin because people started making profit from cacao, or using cacao beans as money instead of like sacred reverence and rituals, and then it became the tree of sin, or greed, if you will. So the point of all that, the cool thing about all this is just entertainment. You don't need to know anything about any of this. All you do is just eat it, and all that's downloaded to you. And the reason I say that, and the fall from grace and everything I've been rambling on about is getting to this point, is that chocolate is the intrinsic representation of the story of Faust. Does anyone know about the story of Faust? The Faustian bargain? Right? Okay, so the Faustian bargain is basically the iconic theme of the hero's journey, or what's been played out through humanity. It's basically the alchemist or the scholar who sells his soul to the devil now for fame and fortune, only to be led to hell 20 years later. It's basically making a deal with the devil, right? We've all heard that idea. Now, Johann Goethe, who was a famous German writer in the 1700s, he actually downloaded this whole story about Faust and the deal with the devil, and from chocolate, I believe, because it shows when I started reading, I didn't know any of this. I didn't know that Goethe was a chocolate addict. But then I actually read the story. I was like, yeah, I know about that. It's probably good. I'm writing a book on chocolate called The Hidden Messages in Chocolate. I should probably read that book. So I read Faust, part 1 and 2, and I found out that actually Faust was a chocolate addict. There was references when he went to Switzerland, like 1733, something like that, and he based it 1780. He took his own chocolate with him because back then Switzerland, according to him, Switzerland only had kind of like swaggy chocolate products. They weren't quite there yet, so he wasn't taking any risks. That right there, that's documented. So that right there told me something. I'm like, oh, whoa, wait a minute. This is interesting. Because he downloaded this whole story on Faust. And so backing up 500 years, when Hernan Cortez went over to the new land, they basically took over the land. They took over, they overruled King Montezuma and the Aztec people. They burned all their scriptures. All we have left on the history is kind of like segregated hieroglyphics and different scriptures, kind of approximating what might have happened. But we really have to use our imagination to kind of like piece it all together. And they took the cacao bean over to Spain and basically took it from what was once revered and noble and a sacrament, and they turned it into a refined, processed form of itself by adding in refined white sugar. And by the way, refined sugar to the Europeans was their choice of recreational drug. Kind of like another white powdered substance that we all know about, right? Which is another refined derivative of the cocoa plant, right? So this is interesting. That's how we've kind of went from this 500-year gap of cacao being a sacred food into our cultural reference as a junk food, right? How could this be a junk food? This was one of the most sacred foods ever, and it got transformed. It got turned into literally junk, right? The story of Faust. Nobility into tainted, contamination, whatever you want to use. I found that very interesting. Now, the second part of Faust is what we're experiencing now. Once Faust goes to hell, how does he get out of it, right? Because another part of the human spirit is redemption, right? How do we, when we make a mistake or something, we have to own up to the consequences, but how do we get out of that? How do we grow out of that? How do we retrieve our nobility. That's what we're seeing now in 2012 in the field of cacao, is it's actually coming back into its noble form, the noble representative of the plant world. In fact, if you look at all the plants in our kind of conventional raw food culture, cacao is one of the only foods that's still in its primal form. Now what I mean by that is it's not hybridized, there's different classifications, different classes of cacao, but it's not genetically modified. Well, there are genetic modifications now, but actually cacao is still in its original primal form as the bean. Like, for example, if you get like watermelons or bananas, right? Bananas that are in the store, seedless fruit, right? What is a seedless fruit or a seedless food? It's a far cry from its origin, right? It's not actually the original food. It's been mutated. Literally, it's been genetically modified in that sense.